Welcome to the Cyber Fusion Report, the podcast where we cut through the noise and expose the gaps putting our enterprises and infrastructure at risk. I'm your host, Gary Mullen, and today we're tackling a truth most companies don't want to face. Your OT environments, the lifeblood of manufacturing, energy, and logistics, are the weakest link in your cybersecurity strategy. But there is a way forward, and it requires a new model, the Cyber Fusion Center. Let's get started. Welcome to the second episode of the Cyber Fusion Report, the podcast where we break through the noise and uncover what's really driving resilience in operational technology. Today, we're diving into the front lines of OT threat hunting, where context matters more than data and where human insight, not automation, turns into action. Joining me today are two industry veterans, not that they're old, they're just veterans who live this every day. Chris Weule, PhishCloud's Director of Operational Technologies, Cyber Fusion and Strategy, brings decades of experience in securing critical infrastructure and industrial systems. Also joining us is Chris Wightman, Senior OT Threat Hunter at PhishCloud. He leads the charge in detecting the unseen, those quiet anomalies that signal something much bigger beneath the surface. Today, we'll break down what real OT threat hunting looks like, why traditional visibility tools are no longer enough, and how Cyber Fusion is changing the game for defenders everywhere. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Let's get to it. First question I have today is for Chris Wightman. To set the foundation for this conversation about OT threat hunting, let's start with this. How is OT threat hunting, operational technology threat hunting, different from IT threat hunting?
Great question. Fundamentally, it's not really that different. The threat hunt methodology essentially remains. It's proactive, hypothesis-based. It's still behavioral-based as opposed to like IOCs, but it's very much data-driven. However, that being said, when we talk about data, which I think we're going to talk a lot about today, the data sources and the data itself is going to be very different. We're talking about largely network-based data, protocols that really don't exist in an IT network, logs, log fields, formats, all that is very much different. But the whole way in which you conduct threat hunt and the threat hunt framework still applies.
And we'll dive more into exactly what that framework is and so forth. But one of the biggest differences between IT and OT is that operational technology, which is the production floor, is 24/7, meaning it's always, the production lines are always running. How do you hunt these anomalies without disrupting operations or production, which can't go down?
Well, another great question. It's one of the first things that comes up anytime we're talking to, clients and you're looking inside it, want to start that process of looking inside of an environment. The key is that we're really doing more of a red team assessment. We're doing passive monitoring, out of band analysis. We're not exactly scanning in a production system or injecting traffic into the network. You're looking for those anomalies off of a baseline. Instead of actually looking at network traffic from the active perspective, we're using network taps and scan ports to create a mirror of the traffic, analyzing that data separately. And you can think of it like security cameras, right? I can have guards in the environment, or I can have a camera and I can look at that off to the side, observing, not touching. Also, we leverage asset inventories, the baseline behavior profiles. You pull a profile and you know what the system looks like. If it's an OT environment, it's pretty static. You know what it should be doing, process control, the general day-to-day behavior should look similar from one moment to the next. So we build out that behavior profile during maintenance windows or during standard activity. And then we take that and look for those anomalies in that passive collection without ever having to touch the PLCs, the HMIs, the historians, right? We can pull the log data itself rather than actually having to touch the active data.
So the plant line never goes down.
Correct.
So, Chris Wightman, you mentioned a moment ago data sources. What data sources are you using in OT threat hunting that may be different from IT threat hunting?
Yeah, it really depends on the environment. With our clients, they have very different architectures, they have very different capabilities, and that goes for both IT and OT. Clients without OT, you're going to see different capabilities and architectures. So really depends largely on your visibility and that architecture. You might be able to get traditional logs that you're used to, endpoint logs on historians in DMZs or HMIs that wouldn't impact the network at all. Don't put a load on the network or cause extraneous traffic or a load on the processors. You'll probably still have firewall logs and proxies that you can investigate. The non-traditional is going to be more in that network traffic again, where you would use those span ports, as Chris had mentioned, and the network taps, or potentially solutions like Dragos or Nozomi, where it's actual sensors on the network. And then you're going to start seeing those non-traditional things, those protocols like Modbus, DNP3, or BACnet, and it's just observing those and understanding those data sets, and going back to Chris, like understanding what's normal and what's anomalous within those data types. So going back to the data all the time.
Right. So, Chris Weule, what gaps, or Chris mentioned visibility, what visibility gaps exist across the OT network?
So there are plenty of gaps. Now, let's be honest here. A lot of that equipment's been put in place 20, 30, 40 years ago. 30 and 40 years ago, a lot of these pieces of equipment didn't even have logging capabilities, let alone modern security telemetry. When we look at how the data is set up, we might actually have network segmentation that someone put in place where they've even forgotten about segments of the network from the perspective of getting the data back to a SIM, or even having a network tap on it, like we would talk about with Dragos. You end up with poorly documented zones. So you end up with something that's isolated. No one's monitoring it simply because no one remembers that it exists. It's a shadow OT network. Then there's protocol visibility issues. A lot of the IT pieces of equipment aren't designed to look at OT protocols. They don't, they just look past them. Everyone's looking at HTTP and proxies. They're looking at, your FTP, but they're not looking at BACnet. They're not looking at Ethernet over IP. So those, DNP3 protocols aren't well understood by the IT side of the world. We're not looking at, deep packet inspection capabilities when it comes to Modbus, right? Finally, there's a gap between what the IT security team thinks behaviors should look like and what the OT engineering team thinks is normal traffic on a day-to-day basis. They're not sharing information effectively because they silo. And that's one of those reasons you have this cyber fusion concept, is to go ahead and have the different teams, work together and cross that boundary, because otherwise the information from one, like you're talking about a threat hunt, right? The information from one type of intrusion might go undetected because it simply doesn't look like a big deal to the IT team, and the IT team doesn't notify the OT team that something's happened.
Okay. So that leads me to a follow-on question to that. How far down, let's say the Purdue model, right? How far down from the gap between IT and OT can an OT threat hunter see, and what kinds of threats or attack behaviors can you actually detect in an OT environment?
So the types of threats. So going down Purdue model, if the client's architecture is segmented and structured as such, it goes back to where your sensing and capabilities are. If you have passive taps placed strategically in the network that can capture the command signals from an HMI to a controller, then you're getting down really far into Purdue, right? And then if you're collecting those logs, and typically if you have a DMZ, you can get endpoint logs and have better visibility. If you have a backup historian that sits in the DMZ, you can get a really good log collection. It really depends, but there are solutions to get very granular data at the signal level and then control or understand what activities are actually occurring on the network to the controllers, to the physical devices. So I guess I would say, it's largely dependent on where you can collect data, and it goes down to that visibility again. But there's opportunity to get very deep.
Okay. So then follow up on that, Chris Wightman. How do you distinguish between a normal process noise in that network and actual malicious behavior?
Yeah, that's almost again not too dissimilar from a threat hunter in an IT network. It's having a deep knowledge and understanding of the network, like understanding where it is, going back to baselining. It takes some time, it's an investment, and to understand what should be occurring. And from there, you can start to extract those anomalies. Another thing that I think is extremely important is documenting the relationships, not just with what devices should be speaking to another device or how, but also who, from a user perspective, who should be interacting with any other device. There should be a very small number of people conducting or sending commands, conducting certain activities and behaviors. So understanding that about your network and having that all documented is a really good way to understand when something's out of sorts. And then that's where the investigation begins. And you start digging in.
I would liken this to the same type of user event behavior analytics, the UEBA, right? Where we turn around and we say, a brand new person just started with a company, right? Is there any reason for this brand new person who's literally been at the company for a day and they work in the mailroom to email 1,500 people in the company tomorrow? But they don't know 1,500 people in the company. And it's unlikely that their position in that particular client space has anything to do with emailing 1,500 people. And the same thing is true of who's logging into the different process controllers or the HMI or the historians. One of those activities that I've seen, we go to a manufacturing environment and I see that, everyone's using the exact same login information because, they can't remember their own unique credentials, right? So they have a shared credential environment. So you don't even know who it is sometimes that's logging into the historian because every single person uses the same credentials. And this type of thing is where, as we modernize and as we bring systems up to the security parameters that we expect, it helps out the threat hunters. It helps out keeping us from that concept where, security brings compliance. If you go ahead, you have in a system the ability to go ahead and have multiple different users and credentials, then that gives us the ability to see who it is that's logging in. And that's why we have those types of controls in place. And you're looking as a threat hunter to go ahead and utilize those applied controls to your advantage to help find the people who are not using the controls the way that they're supposed to be.
Okay, so follow up on that, Chris Weule. You're working in an environment where, they can't patch, they can't reboot systems because it takes plant lines down, which costs money. How do you prioritize your findings and remediation?
So this is where risk-based prioritization becomes critical. We can't use traditional IT playbooks of, if it's critical vulnerability, I have to immediately patch it. That just isn't an option usually. Instead, we ask, what's the potential impact to safety and operations? What's the likelihood of exploitation given the network architecture that we're dealing with? Chris has pointed out that each architecture you deal with is going to be unique, but we have to look at that like, is it a flat network? Is it something where if I immediately have access to a domain controller, I immediately have access to the entire system? Does having access to the system mean anything? Because from the perspective of, okay, so now you know who all the different users are, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can change the process. So we have to look at it from what's the likelihood that the exploitation can actually change the environment that we're talking about. Someone can now see some of the SQL events. They can see something. That doesn't mean they can action upon the environment that we're talking about. It's an operational environment. So what are our compensating controls that we have in place? What we have to look at really is mitigations versus remediations, and what are our operating windows, right? So when's our maintenance window come up? Does this vulnerability that we found, or even an exploitation where somebody's actually in the environment, does that change the process to the point where it's no longer under regulatory compliance? And I've talked, when I've been in pharmaceutical environments where we look at if there's a compromise to the process itself and the controller so that someone could change the temperature, or then the whole process is compromised. Okay, the drug is no longer considered valid and that whole batch has to go out. And that could be, $25 million, and it'd take them 3-4 months. But if it turns out that, someone has entered a portion of the system, there's an actual compromise, someone's there, but it doesn't change the process, then they might want to finish out that batch, for 2 more weeks, because it doesn't change whether or not their batch is regulatory compliance, right? Same thing with energy. It's a 24/7 environment. I want to make sure I can keep these online. And shutting down a nuclear power plant costs me $1 million a day. I don't want to be that guy. So, you have to look at, does this compromise that's being discovered through this threat hunt change the operational compliance of the environment that we're talking about? And what is the acceptable risk? Dragos has a great thing that they do where they say, there's now and there's next and there's never, right? If it's changing the compliance of the situation and changing the safety of the situation, then you have to do it now. It doesn't matter what you want. But we're not looking at integrity of the data. We're looking at availability of the system, right? Making sure that that's still online. So maybe we're just planning for that next maintenance window. The key is working closely with the operations and the engineering team to understand what's truly critical and what the window of opportunity is that exists for remediation. And if you can't put remediation in place because it's a next or it's a never, then what can we do to mitigate? Maybe put in some segmentation that doesn't interfere with the process involved, but keeps the attacker from being able to affect controls.
Right.
Yeah, I could weave into that if I may. It goes back to having that deep understanding of your network and, understanding what are the attack pathways. If you have a breach in one part of the network and you're doing that risk analysis again and to gauge how you might respond, what remediations or mitigations you might put in, and how quickly you need to act. If there's an understanding of what potential that breach has to create effects on critical infrastructure or critical pieces of the network, knowing those and being able to answer those questions is really super important to the decision makers who have to evaluate and make that risk decision and monetary decision. Again, that deep knowledge and then attack pathways.
Right. Okay, Mr. Wightman, You're the OT threat hunter. You're on the hunt, right? What kind of outcomes or deliverables are there from the work that you do?
I love this question. And we get it all the time on the IT and OT side. So you're not going to catch an APT every day. Well, hopefully they're not there. But in the process of conducting threat hunt, you're often digging through data sets that no one looks at. You're observing behaviors, normal behaviors that typically don't get looked at. You're not exploring alerts. So what you end up discovering are things like misconfigurations or non-secure configurations. You'll see that there's non-secure protocols using FTP. Well, why aren't we using SFTP? Is that an option? Can we adjust our posture a little bit? And you find those visibility gaps as well. Like, hey, this is talking to something, but I can't see that other side of the conversation. So we've got some gaps there. How do we remediate that or mitigate that? As CTI comes out, you'll be able to see, or report, these are the devices within our architecture that have these vulnerabilities. Here's the software version or just hardware version, just to inform the security engineers and the risk of what they have and giving them realistic information. Also, we are watching users. So a lot of times you'll see, poor security practices, clear text passwords, saved like things like that. And we report all of those, everything we report. So it's not going to be an APT or an attack or a breach every day, but all of those provide the system owners an opportunity to harden their network and their devices. And that just improves the overall security posture of the enterprise or the organization. So there's secondary and tertiary outcomes to threat hunt that prove very valuable.
Okay, great. I have one last question, and Chris Weule, this is for you. PhishCloud has launched its Cyber Fusion Center strategy solution. We're bringing together people and processes and technology to try to outthink the attacker and stay ahead of operational disruption, i.e. downtime. How does this OT threat hunting fit into that Cyber Fusion philosophy?
Okay, so it's funny because I thought about jumping in on what Chris Wightman was just saying, right? But Cyber Fusion is really about breaking down those silos and having a unified security approach. And Chris was just talking about the idea that as part of the deliverables, you're learning about these gaps and you're learning about user behavior and you're creating these baselines. And that's the proactive approach to moving forward. So in the OT context, what that means is it's bringing together your OT threat hunt, your IT security operations, threat intelligence, the CTI he mentioned, all that vulnerability management. So we're talking about patching and incident response into one coordinated effort. So the idea is that instead of OT and IT operating in separate worlds, they're sharing data, they're sharing context and responding together. So we're taking this deliverable that Chris Wightman was just talking about, and we're applying that holistically throughout the environment. For example, threat intelligence from the IT side about a new ransomware immediately gets contextualized for OT. What industrial protocols might this new ransomware campaign target? Or reaching back to say when Merck was compromised, right? There was a piece of spreadsheet software on the IT side that ended up locking down their operations floor. So looking at where that data from the IT compromise exists in the OT environment might help you understand what OT systems are vulnerable. Meanwhile, that baseline and that ability to detect for anomalous behavior detected through that OT threat hunting gets correlated with IT security events to help understand that full attack chain. It's about collaborations, like taking the platforms that you have and the common technologies and changing that cultural environment so that all of your security works proactively to keep you from having to be down for $1 million a day in a nuclear reactor, or from having to shut down your pharmaceutical floor so that you're losing, $100 billion or something crazy like that. Your OT engineers need to trust your security team, and the security team needs to respect the operational requirements. And that's where Cyber Fusion comes together as, a holistic approach to security, looking now ahead of the attack and mitigating as much as possible to make it so that your attack surface is not the soft target. You want to make yourself, it's that great little anecdote about, I don't have to be the guy that, runs, can outrun the bear. I just can be faster than the guy next to me who can't. So realistically speaking, you want to make sure that you're not the easy target.
Right.
And that, unless you're specifically being, like that, you're the guy that they want, in which case you're dealing with a different type of aspect. And that's what we want OT Threat Hunt to find, is the guys, Chris said, there won't be an APT every day. Well, we hope for an APT never, but
Right.
and that's what we want, is Cyber Fusion to make it an APT never. But at the same time, that's, we want the OT threat hunters to be able to find the guys that are in the system. So the more compliant the system is, the more it's built for that security piece, keeping those legacy systems, because we know that some of them just can't be replaced, but taking the architecture and making it so that we understand segmentation, we understand the baseline, we know where the assets are, we know where our vulnerabilities are and what those pivot points might be, so that someone like Chris Wightman or the other OT threat hunters can say, well, this is the most likely location for an attack. Let me look there first. Let me look in the historian data to see if there's something out of the baseline, right? So having that holistic approach and being proactive gives a company the ability to pivot ahead of the attacker.
And we know that OT is under attack today. Just from recent news articles, there are numerous, not just local or domestic attackers, but nation state attackers who are going after manufacturing, transportation, and critical infrastructure devices as well. So Cyber Fusion becomes all the more important when it comes to protecting and defending the OT environment. Well, that's going to wrap up today's episode of the Cyber Fusion Report. A huge thank you to Chris Weule and Chris Wightman for sharing their insights into what real OT threat hunting looks like in the OT environment. Not just detecting threats, but understanding them in context as well. If there's one takeaway from today's discussion, it's that visibility without fusion, cyber fusion, is just noise. PhishCloud Cyber Fusion Center Strategies turns that noise into intelligence, uniting IT, OT, and even human telemetry so defenders can see faster, decide smarter, and act with precision. To learn how your organization can fuse detection, response, and resilience, visit PhishCloud.com and stay ahead of what's next. Thanks for joining. And don't forget to follow the show for future episodes where we'll continue exploring the evolution of cyber defense across industrial and critical environments. Stay vigilant, stay resilient, and keep your operations secure. This has been the Cyber Fusion Report podcast. Thanks for joining us. And for more information, please visit www.phishcloud.com or email us at cfc@phishcloud.com. Thanks and have a great day.